Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. In 2022 and 2023, the living standard of the Finnish population has fallen. The Social Democrat government has continued cuts to social programs and healthcare, has increased military spending, and has used repressive measures against workers. Finland is a country suffering in the late stage of capitalism, imperialism. In the imperialist stage, mass unemployment has become a permanent phenomenon. The Finnish government has attempted to decrease unemployment numbers, essentially by manipulation of statistics. According to the government statistical office, quote, "An employed person is someone who has worked at least 1 hour during the week in question," unquote. With such low criteria for employment, they ought to be able to eliminate mass unemployment. It is completely obvious that a person working for only 1 or a few hours per week cannot earn enough to survive, and cannot be considered employed. The government also changed the way they report employment numbers. Employment figures are now calculated based on the employment of persons between the ages of 20 and 64, which eliminates 18 and 19-year-olds from the statistics. By doing this, the government has achieved a 6% higher employment rate, albeit only on paper, although, according to the statistical office themselves, there are, quote, "somewhat more unemployed this year than last year," unquote. While billions have been systematically cut from healthcare, the Finnish government has spent €1 billion to arm Ukraine and has planned to spend approximately $4 billion during the course of 2022 and 2023 to support Ukraine further. Finnish military spending was increased by $2 billion last year, on top of the new fighter jets which were purchased at the cost of tens of billions, the new warships, which cost $2 billion, and the provocative wall which Finland is building on its Russian border. While the people suffer from social problems such as mass unemployment, lack of healthcare, and falling real wages, the government is stubbornly putting the people's money into imperialist warmongering and armaments on the instructions of NATO generals. They keep saying that we as a society cannot afford healthcare, we cannot afford public services, we cannot afford retirement, we cannot afford care for the elderly, we cannot afford public childcare, we cannot afford free university education, and we certainly cannot afford better wages or better working conditions. Yet, somehow, we can afford all these imperialist weapons. The truth is that the government's warlike imperialist policy is devastating the country. Real wages fell by more than 4% last year. Largely as a result of the sanctions against Russia, inflation has reached 10% and food prices have increased by 20%. The reformist Social Democrat leadership of the Finnish Industrial Union accepted a wage increase of 5.5% over 2 years, which does not cover the losses suffered by the workers. Living standards and real wages will continue to fall. In comparison, quote, "For example, the wages in the technology and industrial field in Germany will rise by 8.5% in 2 years," unquote. Despite the capitulation of the Industrial Union, whose reactionary leadership also voiced support for the government's decision to join NATO, other unions have launched strikes. Practically, the bureaucratic reformist Social Democrat leadership has only accepted to do so under heavy pressure from activists and ordinary trade union members. Let's look at the situation of the healthcare workers, because it is characteristic. This was the situation in 2020 at the start of the COVID pandemic. In 2020, the Union of Health and Social Care Professionals newspaper wrote, quote, "The situation is worsening even more in the social and healthcare field. Well-being at work has decreased somewhat further in the last 6 months. People are afraid at work, and nearly 90% are considering changing their profession. The COVID pandemic period has been hard for the staff. Coercive measures have been used, but they have not been compensated for. A number of coercive measures have been applied to health and safety professionals. 34% have had their annual holidays postponed, cancelled, or their durations changed. 23% have been transferred to another workplace or task, and 16% say that the notice period, that is, the time before you are allowed to quit your job, has been extended." Respondents were also asked how the employer has compensated for the consequences of coercive measures. Almost all, that is, 97%, state that nothing deviating from the normal working conditions has been compensated for. Almost half, that is 48%, are actively planning a change of field, and a total of 88% have considered it. Only 23% of nurses believe that they will be able to cope with the tasks in the health and social care sector until the end of their working career. 64% would not go into the field if they were starting their studies now." Unquote. The situation had become intolerable in April 2022 when the Union of Health and Social Care Professionals, TEHY, and Finnish Union of Practical Nurses, SuPer, went on strike for 2 weeks. The strike included, quote, "approximately 25,000 nurses in 6 hospital districts," unquote. They also started demonstrations in the cities of, quote, "Helsinki, Turku, Oulu, Tampere, Kuopio, and Jyväskylä," unquote. The nurses complained of bad working conditions, exhaustion, shortage of workers, etc., but mainly they demanded higher pay. The employers did not accept the demand and instead used demagogic attacks against the nurses, as always happens. The nurses were attacked as selfish and endangering patients, although according to the nurses themselves, the patients are endangered every day by the lack of resources and the exhaustion of the workforce, and the government and other employers have never cared about that. According to the Union of Health and Social Care Professionals newspaper, quote, "Trade unions TEHY and SuPer confirmed the starting date of a second wave of strikes. 35,000 nurses in 13 hospital districts are planned to go on strike," unquote. However, this second, larger strike never took place, because the government was able to prevent it. To crush the justified strike action of the nurses, the government quickly began preparing an emergency law to outlaw the strikes. The nurse unions responded in their declaration on April 4th, quote, "According to the nurse unions, the government's proposal for a law on ensuring patient safety during the healthcare labor strike is a mockery of legislative work. The organizations state in their declaration that the government's proposal is based only on incorrect and unidentified information from the other side of the labor dispute about the inadequacy of the protection work. Protection work means measures that healthcare workers need to take to ensure patient safety during strikes. The strike is legal where sufficient protection for the patients is provided and the need for it is constantly negotiated. The country's government is actually enacting a forced labor law against women." Again, as a side note, they say that because most of the nurses are women. According to TEHY and SuPer, the patient safety law, which significantly interferes with the basic rights of employees, that is, the right to strike action and personal freedom, and in practice leads to the breaking of the strike, should not be enacted. The only purpose of the Forced Labor Act is to break the legal labor struggle of the nurses. This is the last straw for nurses. I have received a huge number of messages from members over the last night. Their main content is the statement that this is the last straw, why work in a profession that the policymakers in Finland hate so much, says Milla-Riikka Rytkönen, chairman of TEHY. The organizations state in their declaration that several healthcare units, such as intensive care units, operating rooms, etc., have had a very significant shortage of nursing staff for several years. Several shifts have been regularly run understaffed. The same situation has existed not only in specialized medical care, but also in primary health care and services for the elderly. Under normal circumstances, the employer has not considered the shortage of nurses to be a factor endangering patient safety. Both political decision makers and employers are aware of the level of patient safety during normal times. In everyday life, nurses are left to survive on their own, but when we try to improve the working conditions and pay in the industry by legal means, forced labor is the result, says SuPer's chairman Silja Paavola. The nursing organizations also criticize the process of drafting the law in harsh terms. They say, "Today, April 4th, 2022, at 11 a.m., we were heard at an event where the legislator proposed forcing nurses to work. The invitation to the hearing arrived on Sunday, April 3rd, 2022, at 4:39 p.m. On Sunday, April 3rd, 2022, we only received the board's draft presentation at 6:45 in the evening. So the union had significantly less than a day to draft a response. It is clear that with this schedule, it is impossible to respond thoroughly and sufficiently comprehensively to such a large and important legislative project that affects basic rights, state TEHY's executive director Else-Mai Kirvesniemi and SuPer's advocacy director Anne Sainila-Vaarno. The representatives of the nurses whose basic rights are severely restricted are not even given adequate time to prepare an answer and be heard in the case. in a state governed by the rule of law, the law would not be enacted in this way, they say." Unquote. And this emergency law by the government, which basically banned the nurses from striking, was more or less effective because it prevented the second and bigger strike. And it seems probable that had the nurses been able to strike, they could have gotten much better working conditions and much higher wages. But that didn't happen. The nurse union newspaper states the following, quote, "Tehy and Super announce that they are withdrawing their notice of strike action, which was issued on March 17, 2022. According to the announcement, the strike was supposed to start on April 1st, 2022. Minister Tuula Haitainen postponed the start of the strike by 2 weeks so that there would be more time for mediation. Tehy and Super have voluntarily postponed the start of the strike after Easter so that there would be enough time for mediation. Despite Minister Haatainen's transfer decision and Tehy's and Super's voluntary postponement, mediation activities have not resulted in more than one settlement proposal in more than 6 weeks. The settlement proposal of the national mediator would not have brought any kind of improvement to the salaries and working conditions of the nursing staff. In our opinion, the settlement proposal was of an even lower standard than the previous agreements. During the mediation, even before the start of the first strike, a patient safety law has been prepared under the leadership of Minister Lindén. Minister Lindén has succeeded in making the nurses' strike ineffective with their legislative actions. Because of this, the employer also has no desire to promote reconciliation. We do not consider it expedient to start a strike, which the minister of the government has already rendered ineffective in advance." Unquote. So to me it looks like the government was only playing for time. They ordered the strike to be postponed, then they asked it to be postponed even further, and once the emergency law was unveiled, the government mediator between the workers and the employers gave the workers an extremely bad deal because they knew that the workers couldn't do anything about it, they couldn't go on strike. However, in August of 2022, the nurses again said that they would strike in a more limited capacity in intensive and other specialized healthcare units in the next month in the Turku University Hospital, Southern Helsinki Home Care Unit, Intensive Care Unit of Oulu University Hospital, and the Oulu Home Care Unit. Approximately 20 nurses plan to go on strike in the region of Tavastia proper and 200 in southwestern Finland. The Minister of Labour, Tuula Haitainen, again ordered this strike to be postponed by 2 weeks. Apparently the Minister of Labour is allowed to do that, because practically every strike of the nurses, including the ones in April, were always postponed by 2 weeks. The hospital districts of Tavastia proper, southwest Finland, and northern Ostrobothnia demanded that the Helsinki District Court prevent the strikes, and as a result, the court actually ruled against the nurses, and on September 14th, the unions were banned from starting the strikes in the cities of Hämeenlinna, Oulu, and Turku. The court stated that if the ban was violated, then the unions would have to pay a fine of 1 million euros per hospital district each. That's 3 hospital districts and 2 unions, so a total of 6 million euros. The Finnish state media reported that, quote, "The District Court of Helsinki has accepted the demands of 3 hospital districts for a temporary security measure which forbids the nurse unions Tehy and Super from starting a strike in the intensive care units of the hospital districts next week and the following week." Unquote. After this essentially fascistic measure, one strike still took place in Oulu. This strike also was small and it took place outside of these 3 specified hospital districts, so they didn't have to pay fines for this one. The newspaper of the Communist Workers' Party reported about it that, quote, "The forced labor laws proposed by Marin's 5-party government and approved by the parliament have not discouraged the nurses' unions Tehy and Super. Neither have the strike bans of the judiciary, which threatened fines, made the nurses give up their demands for a salary increase, a salary program, and the improvement of working conditions. Tehy and Super started the nurses' strike on Tuesday, September 27th, in the home care unit of Kotikankaa Myllyoja at the Kotikankaa Welfare Center in Oulu. The strike continued for 4 days and ended on Saturday, 1st of October. The District Court of Helsinki has previously banned strikes by Tehy and Super in 3 hospital districts and home care in Helsinki with the threat of fines of millions of euros." Unquote. The nurses still didn't surrender though, and they demonstrated against the government and against this so-called law on patient safety, which basically prevents nurses from going on strike, no matter how bad their conditions are. This is what one Finnish magazine wrote about it. Quote, "Nurse unions TEHY and SUPER organized a demonstration in Helsinki against the government's proposed patient safety law on Friday. Members of the union marched from Citizen Square to the Parliament building, on the steps of which there was an emotional speech led by TEHY's Millarika Rytkönen and SUPER's Silja Paavola. A strange situation was seen in front of the Parliament building when a Social Democrat member of Parliament, Jukka Gustafsson, arrived to speak to the nurses who demonstrated in the rainy weather. Gustafsson, who introduced himself as a long-term union activist, tried to gain the sympathy of the nurses. "I actually came here because I want to listen and experience the feelings you have," Gustafsson said. Judging by everything, the nurses standing in the rain did not warm to the sympathies of the Social Democrat, but started shouting loudly, demanding higher pay. Gustafsson lost his temper and raised his hands as if to fight back the screams. "Shut up," Gustafsson shouted into his microphone. The demonstrating nurses did not shut up though, but shouted even more loudly. Unquote. After the strikes had been outlawed, the nurses still kept fighting. The nurses decided that they would start quitting their jobs en masse as a form of pressure on the capitalists and the government. The nurse union newspaper reported, quote, "The Board of Representatives of the Social and Healthcare Trade Union TEHY reached a decision about new labor struggle measures last night. The board decided to implement mass resignations of nurses in special and intensive care." Unquote. One nurse who signed the declaration to resign from their job said, quote, "I see no other option at this point than to put my name on the paper and thereby try to speed up this difficult situation." Unquote. Another nurse said, quote, "The position and benefits of our nurses will not improve if radical decisions are not made, so I am happy to be part of this." Unquote. An agreement was finally reached in October 2022, and the nurses are supposed to receive a wage increase of around 17% in the course of 5 years, so that they receive 2.5% for 2022, 4.5% for 2023, 5.5% in 2024, little less than 3% in 2025, and around 1% in 2026 and 2027. Strikes did not end there though, because immediately at the beginning of this year, first service and retail workers went on strike. The newspaper of the Communist Workers' Party reports the following. Quote, "The service industry union, PAM, and retail workers were on a 2-day strike from 9th to 11 February 2023. The strike included 16,000 workers in 160 stores. The trade union says that it became aware of several cases where the employer had acted improperly and prevented employees from exercising their right to strike, even though the strike is a constitutional right. According to the union, communication about the strike had also been disrupted and striking workers had been threatened with sanctions. A new 2-day strike would begin on Monday morning, February 13th, if no agreement is reached in the labor dispute on Sunday, February 12th. There would be 47 distribution centers and wholesale warehouses within the scope of the strike. About 4,000 employees would go on strike. An even wider strike would be coming from 16th to the 18th of February. 26,000 workers and 415 shops would then be on strike. The goal of the workers in the retail sector and the trade union is a 1-year collective agreement and a salary increase of €200 for everyone." Unquote. Transport workers also went on strike. The newspaper reports, quote, "The Automotive and Transport Workers Union, AKT, will start striking, lasting at least 6 days on Wednesday, February 15th, 2023, if an agreement acceptable to the employees in the working conditions and salary dispute is not reached before then. The strikes concern several contract areas of the union. The strikes include the stevedoring sector, the trucking sector, the tanker and oil product sector, and the shipping and warehouse terminals operating sector. In Finland, the purchasing power of employees only continues to weaken, as real earnings already fell by more than 4% last year. The smallest wage increases in Europe are now coming to Finland." Unquote. The post and logistics workers went on a sympathy strike to support the transport workers. The logistics trade union PAU announced on February 16th that, quote, "PAU supports AKT, the sympathy strike begins." Unquote. According to the Finnish State Railway Corporation, the railway workers' trade union, RAU, is also threatening to stop all railway traffic starting next Monday, that is March 30th, until further notice, if the demands of the workers are not met. According to the state media, the railway workers mainly demand the ability to rest properly between shifts. To me, it sounds like the employer wants them to do so-called double shifts, that is, to work 2 shifts back-to-back or almost back-to-back. In conclusion, despite the bureaucratic, reformist, social democrat leadership of various trade unions, which don't want to go against the capitalists or the social democrat government, there is significant pressure from workers themselves, which explodes into strikes. The living standard of the workers will continue to fall, and the government will continue its anti-people policy, again creating more resistance. These processes are part of the general crisis of imperialist capitalism. We must give our support to the workers, organize and educate each other. Capitalism has no future, the future belongs to the workers.